So before I get to the questions, there's a quote that I came across today that I wanted to share with you. It's from T.F. Powys. His brother was John Cowper Powys, who I consider to be the second greatest novelist of the 20th century. Now, it's an interesting family. There were 11 children, and 4 of them ended up becoming novelists. One of them was an atheist rationalist, one a pagan, and the other one a sort of unorthodox Christian. This quote comes from the Unorthodox Christian, and he writes, "Though not of the church, I am of the church. Though not of the faith, I am of the faith. Though not of the fold, I am of the fold. A priest in the cloud of God, beside the altar of stone. Near beside me is a flock of real sheep. Above me, a cloud of misty white embraces the noonday light of the altar. I am without belief. A belief is too easy a road to God."
Well, when it gets right down to it, beliefs are like opinions in terms of their reality. You can believe anything, which I think in a certain sense is maybe the original Protestant error.
Oh, interesting.
I mean, I've thought of it that way.
The interesting thing about Protestants is Protestants tend to be some of the most interesting in how divergent they are on the spectrum of how wrong they are or how right they are. In the sense that some of the people that I think are most right about religious things have happened to be Protestants, and some of the ones that are most wrong happen to be Protestants.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things that's interesting about that, but maybe that's itself a criticism of Protestantism, that it allows for such a thing. And then it's basically, if a person is right, it's probably more the individual that happens right rather than any influence of Protestantism itself.
Yeah, Protestantism doesn't have much of an anchor. They tie a rope to they tie a rope to this book.
That reminds me my story about how my friendship with Sufism enriched my Catholic faith starts with Protestants being wrong, if you'd like to hear it.
You're going from Protestants being wrong to Sufism and enriching your faith?
That's exactly the path, yes.
Okay, well, I had asked you about that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed thinking about it, if you don't mind a diversion.
I hardly think that's a divergence.
Okay, thank you. Well,
but I wonder if we should note here that maybe this is where the recording starts.
Okay.
For anybody who is listening, there's been a lot of discussion about history and politics and so forth, and maybe this is where this real recording starts. And
this session is mostly preamble.
Yeah, so this is all dismissible, I think, up to this point where it gets interesting. Okay, Abigail?
Yeah,
well, thank you.
Okay,
I will try my darndest. Well, my story begins with a bad science book that I used with my children. And we chose a science book because it was much more hands-on than the usual textbook. It was learning through experiments, that sort of thing. But I noticed a disturbing trend in it. And it seemed to me that the author was trying to show that the physical world is not very coherent. And that seemed like a strange thing for a science book to do. And I realized it was because he saw the coherence of the physical world as a challenge to God's omnipotence. And then so you have things like, if the earth were 3 miles further away from the sun, it would, maybe not 3 miles, it would be too cold for life to exist. And if it were any closer, it would be too hot for life to exist. So that proves that God put it in exactly the right place. And of course, this is a well-known fallacy among scientists. It's the weak anthropic principle, I think what it's called.
I think
so. it's not God put the earth here so that people could live on it, but life is on this planet because it happens to be the one of all the planets that's in the right position.
Yeah,
so
well suited.
yeah, so it's bad science, but it's also bad religion, because the designer who designs a system that needs constant tweaking and constant additions and adjusting to make it work is a bad designer. So we run into this dilemma. If the world doesn't run well on its own, then it's a bad system. If it does run well on its own, then we don't need God. So this is, this is the fideistic dilemma. Fideism is the opposite extreme from rationalism. It's both rationalism and fideism think that faith and reason are incompatible, but fideism chooses faith over reason. And the solution to this dilemma is the radical imminence of God, as expressed by Ibn Arabi. So the world manifests God, so it's not a challenge to him. And how could it be otherwise? There's no being apart from God. So if there's anything at all, you'd expect to find it completely ordered. But once you understand God's immanence, then the order of the world isn't any kind of challenge to God's omnipotence. So, and like I said last week, the reason we end up with this Protestant fideistic dilemma is that we've been so afraid of pantheism in the West that we're afraid to talk about God's immanence. But the Catholic Church has the sacraments, which of course were rejected by the Protestants. And the sacraments are God working through nature. So the idea that God's life suffuses nature is very natural for a Catholic. But I'd never taken it that seriously before until I ran into my Sufi friends and Ibn Arabi. And I have a couple of examples of how this new way of thinking solves some Catholic Protestant dilemmas that I've kind of had all my life. And one of them is evolution. So from a Protestant point of view, evolution is absurd because it reverses the great chain of being, right? In the Protestant idea of evolution is that it's the lesser giving rise to the greater, which is impossible.
That's a scientific view, that it's just complexity that makes something higher, not anything inherent.
But if you start with the premise of the radical immanence of God, then it's God's immanence that's drawing the greater out of the lesser. So there's no insult to the great chain of being. Does that make sense? That's so.
Yes, it does.
It does.
Like, I don't know if there's a strong enough scientific case for evolution, but I tend that way on theological grounds, and I like to say that to people because it scandalizes them so much. I don't think science can prove evolution, but I believe it on theological grounds. Because if God is the deepest thing within the material world, then you'd expect it to be bursting with life, I think there must be life on other planets for the same reason. How could there not be? The world is soaked with the life of God to its very core.
How can you answer anything else without limiting God?
That's right.
Yeah. So, and then just quickly, I don't want to take too much time, but the other example is that this understanding of the radical immanence of God. I said that this idea of the radical immanence of God makes me understand the Catholic teaching on hell more clearly. So one thing as a child, and I was a Protestant as a child, I was always taught that hell is where God is not. And now that sounds totally absurd to me. Like, how could there be a place where God is not? How would it exist at all? Right. So I'm not saying there's no hell. I don't know what it would be. I certainly don't have any reason to believe anybody has ever or ever will be damned, which is fine as a Catholic. I can hold that without contradicting any Catholic teaching. But if there's a hell, it's some veiling from God. It's not an absence of God, because I understand much more clearly now how the idea of the absence of God is completely absurd.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, one of the things that helped me reconcile evolution was when I suddenly thought about it as not a projection from God, but a reflection from the limit of being, from the edge of nothingness, and that naturally it would develop initially with things that were less like God. I mean, they couldn't not be God, but they'd be less like fullness of God. So if you see evolution as a reflection that God drew manifestation out of being.
That's consistent with how we see the rest of the world.
Yeah, and I don't know if evolution's true or not. How would I know? but it certainly makes sense on a certain level.
Yes, and I'll also add that I don't know whether it's true or not, but it isn't science, because science, whether you're Aristotle or whether you're 20th century philosopher, science is about the ability to make predictions.
Yes,
right.
I remember, and it's the difference between a theory and a hypothesis too.
That's right. Hypothesis, experiment, results.
Right.
Prediction. Right.
And also, a hypothesis is not necessarily verifiable, and because it can be wrong. And I remember once using hypothesis to refer to evolution instead of theory in the presence of what's his name, Doug? He wrote Gödel, Escher, and Bach.
Hofstadter.
Yes, Hofstadter, right. He was in the computer science department here. I was talking with him once, and I said, well, I'm not always sure about the evolutionary hypothesis, and he lost it.
Really?
Said, hypothesis? It's only a hypothesis now?
That's exactly the right word for it.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, regarding evolution, so much mental energy has been wasted on something that I think is a rather fruitless topic.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think if you get outside of orthodox Western ideas of things, you can easily reconcile the idea of what may or may not be true in evolution with whatever is true in religion. I think, if you look to Hindu or Buddhist metaphysics, particularly look to that great bugbear of the traditionalists, Sri Aurobindo.
Yes.
He explains things very well. Simply, let's just say there's evolution. That fits in easily. You have reincarnation. You have not just the spiritual development of the soul over time, but you have a spiritual development of the entire universe, all that is. And then there's this one short passage from Lawrence that I just think is absolutely magisterial, if you don't mind. He says, before we can begin any of the humane sciences, we must take on trust a purely unscientific fact, namely that every living creature has an individual soul, however trivial or rudimentary, which connects it individually with the source of all life, as man, the religious terminology, is connected with God and inseparable from God. So is every creature, even an ant or a louse, individually in contact with the great life urge which we call God. To call this connection the will to live is not quite sufficient.
No.
It is more than a will to persist. It is a will to live in the further sense, a will to change, a will to evolve, a will towards further creation of the self. The urge towards evolution, if you like, but it is more than evolution. There is no simple cause and effect sequence. The change from caterpillar to butterfly is not cause and effect. It is a new gesture in creation.
Mm-hmm.
Science can wriggle as hard as it likes, but the change from caterpillar to butterfly is utterly unscientific, illogical, and unnatural if we take science's definition of nature. It is an answer to the strange creative urge, the God whisper, which is one and only, the everlasting motivation for everything.
Yeah, he's talking about the radical imminence of God, the God whisper.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's beautiful. And I don't like this understanding of the cosmos that needs a designer inserting things. Like back in the 70s, I think it was, or maybe the 80s, there was this biosphere that they made. Does anyone remember? It was supposed to be it was enclosed in
what did they called it? It was like biosphere. Well, I don't think it was quite that word.
Yeah,
but it was a hermetically sealed environment.
Biodome.
No,
they put some people in it, and it was supposed to produce its own oxygen and be a replica. And then it came out that they were secretly pumping oxygen into it because it wasn't quite working. And that to me is a perfect image of this fideistic, all transcendence and no imminence cosmos. God has to be pumping a little oxygen, a little design, making exceptions here and there. It's a bad system that needs overriding all the time and exceptions and things added to it. I don't think that the world is like that. And there's something fake about it, right? Like that's the Protestant, I shouldn't paint with such a broad brush, but some fideistic Protestants see the world like that. It's a stage or an arena that we're put in, but it's fake, and that's very dangerous.
Yeah. Then it doesn't matter what you do to it.
Oh, there's that too. Yeah. Dr. Nasser would say that's the root of all our environmental problems.
Yeah, the lack of the imminence is. You could also think of the cosmos or creation as a ripening fruit, and that would make it that would make good evolution. Just starting from primordial pistils and stamens, and when it's completely ripe, God will eat it.
If you think of the world as a fake arena that we're stuck in, that we're inserted into, then you have a lot more trouble with the problem of evil as well.
Yes.
Because it's not real. So if it's just rules that God's making up for fun, then he could just change the rules, Right. But if it's a real environment and everything here in the world it is real and what we do here matters, then it's a lot easier to see why God doesn't step in and interfere and change the rules in order to prevent suffering. Although I don't want to say that he doesn't, because I also believe that he does.
Yeah.
I just don't know how or why and when and how much.
I think we just need to have a holistic conception of things. I think when you have a one-sided interpretation of what God is or what the cosmos is, it can actually lead to very sort of perverse opinions. I mean, the idea that God is a wholly transcendent sort of clockmaker.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
Some truth that led to deism, and then that led to agnosticism, and then to materialist atheism. So though that wasn't the intention of the people that originally, came up with that doctrine, that's where it led. And so we need to make sure that we keep in touch with all of the aspects of the divine, not just one of them.
So what happens if you have imminence without transcendence? Where does that lead?
I mean, that's also a problem, because I think the best example of that is Spinoza. Spinoza in metaphysics is pure immanence without transcendence. And modern day Spinozans would say, well, if everything is purely immanent and God is in the matter and that's all God is, then ultimately God is nothing more than a term that can be dispensed with.
Yeah, that's a fallacy. Nobody said that. Nobody needs to say that God is nothing more than the form and structure or whatever of His creation. That the cosmos is the sole manifestation of God. I mean, it might be. I don't know. But the point is that you can't equate multiplicity with unity. So, yeah. So it doesn't work. There's a flaw in that logical progression from God's immanence to basically God is material almost.
Yeah, it's funny how you start the path that Badria just traced with. You start with transcendence and you end up with atheism. What a strange progression. Counterintuitive, but really convincing. I thought that was brilliant.
Well, what was?
That you start out with just transcendence without immanence, and then you have God as the clockmaker, and then in step by step you end up with atheism.
Yeah, and also the clock is badly designed, according to a lot of believers who think that God's hand is in every minute thing that happens, not realizing that denies free will.
Exactly. It's all a sham.
Of course, Ibn Arabi talks sometimes as if everything is an act of God, but he doesn't mean it that way, I don't think. The action of God, you might say, is life. However you think of life, nonetheless, it's not a thing. Yeah.
I think Sheikh Isa actually said it best. In Language of the Self, he said, whoever understands the real nature of the world will at the same time escape from psychological enslavement to it. And this is already a great gain. We say this without any optimism and without losing sight of the fact that the present world is a necessary evil whose metaphysical root lies in the last analysis in the infinity of divine possibility. And so both those that say this is, an evil world and it shows that God is evil, descending in some sort of Gnosticism, and those that say in Panglossian terms, this is the best of all possible worlds, they're going off into two extremes that are both wrong. This world is what it is because it's within the realm of divine possibility, and one should revel in that because one has been given the great gift of experience. So maybe less focus on criticizing things or not, and more focus on reveling in it.
I think that's wonderful. I think you're onto something important, really important. You're still here onto something important.
Yeah, I think I said what I needed to say.
Any more from you, Abigail?
I said everything that I wanted to say. Thank you for listening.
I thought that was a lovely development. Thank you.
Yes.
Well, it's taken place in my mind over these many years, coming up on 18 years, I think.
Isn't that amazing?
Hard to fathom.
Abby, have you read the autobiographical work of Louis Massignon, the scholar?
No. That would be interesting.
It's interesting. It's out of print, but I read it a number of years ago from a copy I found in a library, and Masen Yun basically said something very similar to Abby. He was a practicing Catholic, but he was a practicing Catholic who in his youth was losing touch with Catholicism, and getting in touch with Sufism actually gave him a renewed faith in Catholicism.
Mm-hmm.
And felt like Sufism and Catholicism, if practiced with the right attitude, could be an antidote to Protestantism and the more exoteric and ugly forms of Sunni Islam.
Yeah. Well, good for him. He had a good experience with it.
Yeah, that's great.
But I think it makes perfect sense. My appreciation for Christianity has increased because of Sufism, and my willingness to appreciate other traditions has also helped my understanding. And so all the traditions seem to have gotten better since I started looking into Sufism.
It's interesting because I was raised in a Catholic household, and many American Catholic households, they're really not Catholics, they're Protestant Catholics, if that makes any sense.
Sure.
It left a bad taste in my mouth. And interestingly enough, the only thing that really gave me a renewed sense of enjoyment in Catholic art, philosophy, theology, and tradition is actually a deep and profound study of the pagan authors, because one can see that so much of the truth and vivid beauty of the pagan world lives still in actually orthodoxy, the more traditional forms of Catholicism.
Yeah, and the more traditional form of Catholicism allows for the appearance of Christ being a sacrifice made by God.
Reading the Odyssey was a revelation to me, because in the Odyssey, there's gods just under the surface of the sea and just behind every tree, and you're always getting a glimpse of a god out of the corner of your eye. Or Athena has been there and she's not there anymore, but her glory remains. That the whole world was like that. And I thought, gee, as Catholics,
it was alive with enchantment. Yes.
Yeah. We talk about sacramental vision, but we don't see the world like that. We're under the spell of scientism. We see, molecules bouncing around.
Yeah. Oh, now I remember what I was going to say. Not that it's that profound, I guess. But the thing about God's sacrifice, he sent his only begotten and to hang on the cross. But even becoming material, creation of the cosmos is a kind of sacrifice, because it can both reveal and obscure God.
The sacrifice, the kenosis, is the pouring out of God's divinity, and kenosis describes both the incarnation and the crucifixion. So that passage from Paul's letter to the Philippians that I like so much, though he was in the form of God, Christ didn't deem equality with God something to be grasped, but he emptied himself. And in addition to the incarnation as the God emptying himself, you can see creation as God emptying himself too.
Right, but he didn't become empty in the process.
No, how could he? How could being not be being? Wouldn't be being.
Yeah, isn't that kind of what kenosis means, isn't it? Emptiness? Maybe. Somehow I thought it was.
And another thing is that I think this whole dichotomy between spirit and matter is misplaced. To be too focused on one at the exclusion of the other is always an error. To say, I'm so focused on the spirit as opposed to matter, as opposed to the body, that itself is a spiritual disease, because matter itself is not a form of nothingness. It's not a descent into nothingness, but it's also a living form of manifestation of the divine. and the body is beautiful, the matter is beautiful. A slab of granite is a living thing. And that's an important lesson, because I think as much as atheist materialists that forget that everything is spiritual make an error, I think those that are religious and basically disclaim all of matter are also making a grave error.
Yes, yes.
Yes, matter is only a problem when it becomes an ism.
The farther back you go, I mean, look, the stories and myths in the Greek legends, all of the writings from the subcontinent, and so on and so forth. I mean, even someone like Shankara doesn't disparage matter, doesn't disparage manifestations of gods and such. It's just interesting to me how someone could be given the great gift of experience in life and then say, this is a terrible imprisonment and punishment. I'm going to on destroying the body and excluding myself from everything I've been given in order to focus on God. Whereas I think God wants us to fully experience life. Experiencing life in the right way is in fact worshiping God.
Makes sense to me. I mean, experience is mystery, and we all experience the thing that people call matter, which already gives us some reality, because experience is a living thing, and even if you were experiencing something dead, it'd still be a living thing. So how can anything be dead?
Good question.
It all exists in experience, which is a miracle.
And even science proves this. Like some of the more recent theories of the physicists that say that basically, you know, even in a vacuum, there's not nothing. You know, everything is. I mean, dark matter and all of these other things. There is no such thing as nothingness. It doesn't exist. There's only fullness.
Yeah, well, and what we call emptiness is fully open to creation. And in fact, apparently, in absolutely empty space, it doesn't stay empty because particles keep popping in and out of existence. So, you know, what we call emptiness is divine possibility.
Yes.
On the other hand, you know, as much as disparaging the material world and everything can be very unhealthy, one thing that I do think that traditional civilizations had a leg up on is that there were so many monasteries. Traditionally, someone could just go to a monastery and spend a few days or weeks or a month there and simply recharge spiritually. And I know people that have gone to Mount Athos and they still have that tradition of a pilgrim is just able to come and spend some time and pray with the monks. And I think this is a beautiful thing, that we should have more of this. I think we should have, you know, free and open retreat centers for people to spiritually recharge, because life is beautiful, but it can also be pretty difficult at times.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think the idea of, you know, living in a world that's full of monasteries is really good, because you realize, I mean, that in itself is almost a proof of imminence, that, you know, it can be anywhere and everywhere. If you've got monasteries all over the place, and when you travel, you go from monastery to monastery, that's pretty amazing.
And the cloistered monasteries and convents are a special sign of imminence. They enclose places.
Yes.
Well,
need more monasteries. Need more people that need monasteries, or that want them.
That want them. Yeah. I think, wouldn't it be beautiful if people wanted more time in monasteries and less stuff? It makes me sad when I see or hear stories about someone selling one of their kidneys to get the newest iPhone. every year that a new iPhone comes out, you always hear a story about someone selling one of their internal organs so that they can afford it.
Well, I don't know if it's happened or not, but the story is very illustrative of something.